Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening and watching my talk today. I would like, in turn, to say thank you to the South Asia Institute for the opportunity to talk about my work. My objective today is, in a sense, methodological. I want to talk about some challenges involved in doing engaged ethnographic work with indigenous communities, drawing from my field work with Jenukoroba communities in Bandipur, which is in Karnataka in South India. So it may come as a relief to you, perhaps, to know that I'm going to avoid explicitly theoretical vocabulary for the most part, but I think you will see the echoes of theory in my presentation regardless. So I'm going to start today by setting the scene. I'll talk about the case, some context. I'll talk about the project that I've been doing since 2015. And following from that, I will go on to talk about this term that I have, or the see I'm becoming theoretical already, this term that I have called microintervention, which I've defined as situated, small scale, responsive action in the context of long term ethnographic involvement. And after that, I'll talk about potentials and pitfalls of microinterventions, the question of whether or not we should act or whether or not we shouldn't act during the process of doing our research. But without further ado, let me start by setting the scene. The broader project in which I was involved between 2015 and 2020 was a study of conflicts around natural resource management in ecological buffer zones. That is, areas where animals are protected and humans also live. This project was funded by the Swedish Research Council. Um, Buffer zones are politically controversial, with multiple fault lines. Perhaps the most fundamental one has to do between, on one hand, approaches that Daniel Bruckington has famously called fortress conservation, that seek to encircle buffer zones and render them free from human impact, versus more locally responsive stewardship approaches, which argue that natural resources are best managed through community involvement, notably by those most affected by the conservation of natural resources. Our broader project that the Swedish Research Council supported stretches across 6 countries, and across these countries, we established considerable support for the latter approach, the stewardship approach, especially when it centers indigenous communities. The political back and forth between fortress conservation and stewardship approaches is complex in South Asia, and it's covered by multiple potentially contradictory laws, not least of which is the Forest Rights Act, and it is subject to all kinds of political influences, and it will be an important yet only partially explained backdrop to my discussion. This particular study began as an examination of dynamics of displacement amongst an indigenous community, the Jenukoroba tribe, in Bandipur National Park in the tri-state area between Karnataka, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu in South India. Bandipur forms part of the Nilgiri biosphere, where I grew up. About 5,000 square miles of reserved land, 1,000 or so in the reserve, and 4,000 or so in the buffer zone. The Jenukoroba are considered by the government to be a, quote, most primitive tribe, unquote, now called by the only slightly less insulting moniker, most vulnerable tribe. They are a honey gathering community historically. Jenu means honey, and Koroba means people or community. I could be vastly more complicated about this definition, but not today. Theirs is an ancient identity, and grounded, as many indigenous communities around the world are, in a holistic, integrationist view of people, place, and life, where human existence is intricately interwoven with the forest and all other forms of life. Theirs is also a tragic history. They number approximately 30,000 now. Individual, or rather, specific communities are often close to destitute. They sometimes take products to the city to try and get money, often honey. There are all the typical problems that you might expect related to health, livelihood, longevity, fertility, education, and so forth. As our fieldwork progressed, we became more and more interested in silences around deliberative processes that restore community forest rights. Community forest rights are the rights of indigenous people, or Adivasis, the first people, to access forest rights for traditional purposes. And these community rights were enshrined by law in the 2006 Forest Rights Act after considerable agitation by Adivasi groups and networks across South Asia. Access to these forests is supposed to be determined through deliberation by the entire Adivasi community, in keeping with their oral traditions which date back thousands of years. In practice, however, the Forest Rights Act is problematically implemented. In Karnataka, for instance, over 96% of petitions are actually denied, a much higher percentage than the rest of the country, but still a highly problematic figure. Here, I'm going to talk a bit more about a methodological tack, not so much an explanation of deliberative silencing per se. I just wanted to use that as a bit of a framing device so you can understand why we were interested in the things that I'll soon discuss. We began in 2015, as I said, with an initial field visit in consultation with NGOs and tribal leaders all over in India in 2016. And as a result of this consultation, we established the need for the project to contribute towards ongoing reporting of the implementation of Community Forest Rights Acts and the resettlement of formerly nomadic tribes into colonies. And looking back, there have been 3 phases to our work. In phase 1, which we began in 2017, we focused on the dynamics of displacement, the various phases in which communities themselves had been displaced as the buffer zone expanded and expanded and expanded, and they continued to be pushed further out into the peripheries of the buffer zone. As a matter of fact, we identified 5 phases of displacement where individual communities had been shifted and moved into colonies 5 times over the last 50 years. In phase 2, we focused on 6 hamlets and did about 45 ethnographic interviews or so to get a deeper sense of issues involved in the deliberative silencing that occurred as these communities tried to regain access to the forest that they had been shut out of. And during that process, in 2019 or so, what I'm now calling phase 3 emerged, and that's microintervention. And intervening, as those of you who may have done ethnographic work already know, is invariably a part of ethnographic work. You're always doing small things. For example, somebody might be sick and you take them to a doctor, or a child might need help with some schoolwork, or somebody needs to go from one part of the village, from one small hamlet to another hamlet that's 5 kilometers away, and it's a really hot day, so you help them out. But the question that I began to get interested here was, what happens if you build the intervention into the ethnography itself? As in, where it's not a sideshow, but it's actually part of the method. In that sense, it's a small version of what we call action research. But here, the goal isn't so much to engage in effective action or even figure out what effective action might be, as it is to get a much richer sense of the deprivation and cultivated dependence of Adivasi communities upon the Indian state. So let me go through the micro-intervention through this vignette itself and then discuss a few implications. And that'll be the extent of my presentation for you today. On the 27th of November 2018, we were doing interviews at Guddekere, one of 7 Jenukorubas resettlement hamlets that dot the rolling hills around Mangala Panchayat, which you can actually see in the picture in the background there. It was our second interview that day with a woman named Balamma, who you can also see in the picture. We were asking her scores of questions about Jenukoruba customs, including those related to marriage, births, and deaths, trying to get some insight into traditional forms of communal deliberation, traditional occasions that the community came together to make decisions about the collective good. As I've said, the Janukuruba are an ancient tribe, over 3,000 years old. Their language predates Sanskrit, and some of the customs that they still practice continue to be very distinct from the surrounding Hindu dominated caste communities. Like all interviews, this one immediately became a bit of a group discussion, with Rajesh, two children, and another woman, Kempama, squatting on the side of the road beside us. It was evening, and the air was getting cool. Balama suddenly stopped us mid question and said, "You're asking me a lot of questions. Do you know this is preventing me from walking for 3 kilometers to get water? And if I go now, it is going to be dark. So I will now not go at all. But I've given you a lot of my time. What are you going to give me?" Gudukere, like a lot of other resettlement hamlets, was built to settle Janukuruba in the buffer zone of the biosphere, as I've just explained, in the latest phase of their displacement, which was about 20 years ago. So they've been in this community for about 2 decades now, which is a generation. So it is not near a natural water source, but a rainwater pond was dammed near the village when it was created. And that's the pond that you can see there in the picture with the village and with the hamlet in the background. Adivasis have, with the help of locals, made mud dwellings next to the concrete buildings. And over here you can actually see the new lane in the hamlet that was built by the state as part of the displacement. But Adivasis themselves don't live in the new hamlets, which you can see on the right hand side. They live in huts on the left hand side, which they themselves made because those huts were a lot more amenable to hot weather. And that's one hut. Goats now live in the original concrete dwellings. In fact, the goats are everywhere, and anytime we actually engaged in an interview, and you can see Kashika there, the goats and lambs would literally climb into our laps. Anyway, Balama told us that they'd had no water from the village borewell for 12 days, which you can see pictured here. That cylindrical structure there is the borewell that drills down into the water table and fills up the pond that I showed you a little while ago. This only source of drinking water in Gudukere was the nearby pond that you saw. And it is the very same pond where elephant and wild boar go for water and where people also go to defecate. Rajesh, the child, and Kempama, during that conversation, then chimed in and said that everyone who drank the water was sick, probably with diarrhea. We asked what was wrong with the borewell, and they said they just didn't know, just that it was not working and the water was not refreshing. We looked at each other and said that we would talk with someone we knew, and that we would come back the next morning to see if anything had happened. On our way back, we stopped off at Mangala, the Panchayat, the local council office, and spoke with Kalaswamy, a local electrician who used to work for the local Panchayat. But Panchayat in Hindi means village council. In his words, they hadn't paid him in 4 months, so he quit his job. He refused point blank to deal with the borewell problem, saying that if he looked at this well, it would give the government agent an excuse to say that someone screwed it up, so we're not going to touch it. Instead, he said, go to the local linesman who lives in Lokere, which is another hamlet where we ourselves were staying. So we went to Lokere and couldn't find the local linesman. The next morning, we drove back up the hill from Lokere to Gudukere. And to our surprise, 2 men were looking at the borewell, and that picture actually was taken. That was one of the men who was actually looking at the borewell. Kashika and I went up to them and said, well, we fixed it, and all that's happened is that the fuse blew. The fuse had blown. And then we asked, are you sure it's been fixed? And at that point, they said, well, actually, we're not sure. Why? Because there's no electricity. And only when there is electricity would we be sure that it has actually been fixed. And we said, who sent you? And they said, well, the Panchayat actually sent us. So, electricity, as you might imagine, is a problem in Gudukere, as it is in other Janukuruba settlements in the area, each of which have about 100 to 150 people in them, about 20 households in each hamlet. Because electricity is switched on for only 3 hours a day on a rotating basis to help with irrigation of surrounding fields. There is, in fact, a state government scheme to provide 24-hour electricity to villages, called Nirantara Jyoti, which means eternal light, ironically enough. Um, the electric department put up the poles, but the forestry department blocked the installation of the wires, saying that it would interfere with the eco-sensitive elephant corridor and that it should be laid underground in rubberized casing, which makes sense in many ways. But the electricity department in turn responded to them to say, well, we don't have the budget to do so, and that has resulted in an impasse. Um, in fact, we believe that the forest department has a vested interest in keeping life primitive because they don't necessarily want progress or development, because the fewer resources people have, the fewer of them there will be in the buffer zone of the Nilgiri biosphere, and therefore building a fortress, as it were, around that buffer zone would be that much easier. So what you see in the buffer zone are a lot of electricity poles around the place with no wiring. That's exactly what you see right here. So, realizing that we needed a way to ascertain whether the well was working, we then went to another woman in the village. The only one we could find who had a mobile phone, which was, surprisingly, charged. And we said we'd call her to find out whether the borewell was working or not. At lunch that day, we talked things over and decided to document what we were doing closely so that we could build it more organically into the study. Because at that point, we were still sort of conducting interviews about displacement. At any rate, after lunch, after trying many times, we finally established through her name's Shivamma, that although the electricity was back, the pump was still not working. We then called a private water supplier and asked them to send a tanker up that afternoon. And Srikanta, one of my colleagues, said that he would find a three-wheeler to take an empty 2,000-litre tank up the bumpy track to Gudukere, and we would make sure that the water was on site. He departed on his motorcycle, and we went back to Gudukere after lunch to find that the private tanker had already arrived, and the driver was already showing signs of impatience. We managed to pacify him while trying to raise Srikanta on the phone on the feeble mobile network. He finally arrived 2 hours later with the empty tank which we needed to empty the water into, and we set that tank under the banyan tree, and the tanker filled it. And we did the last part manually to get as much water as we could so that the tank itself would fill before the tanker rumbled hastily down the road to provide the rest of the water to a local resort. And the fact, I can tell you, that the water would end up in a 5-star hotel swimming pool did not sit particularly well with us at that point. We then met Kalaswamy again, who was in the picture, who said that the Panchayat Development Officer the PDO, had called him because Manu, another friend, who had been with us the previous day, had called the officer when he reached Mysore, the closest big city, that morning. The development officer said he had no idea what his office had done and was not aware of the problem at all. In the meantime, Srikanta had checked to see that the complaint had actually been filed from a neighboring village 12 days previously and had gone to the local Panchayat office despite the head officer not knowing anything about it. And the fact that the linesman had gone up to the hill to Gudukere that morning was entirely coincidental. Someone else we spoke with later that afternoon, Nagamma, told us that the lady in the village who received the original complaint had probably passed it on, but did not communicate any urgency to the request, as she was prone to take complaints by tribals very lightly. That's why it took 12 days. So the rumbling that we had caused did not actually affect any local networks. It had gone straight to Mysore. And that, I think, is one of the interesting parts of this narrative. At any rate, the next morning Srikanta went up to Gudukere, found out that more people had gone to look at the borewell and that they were replacing a part of it. At 1 that afternoon, we got a text to say that there was water coming from the well. And Manu's call to the public distribution office had obviously made a difference. 5 months later, the borewell was still working, and then when we went back in the middle of 2019, we found that the borewell was still working. So let me talk a little bit now in this last part of my conversation with you today about the question of to act or not to act. As I said at the outset, microinterventions, which I defined as small-scale responsive action in the context of long-term ethnographic engagement, have considerable potential to enrich the quality of ethnographic research, and they can constitute an ethically responsive form of community based research. A microintervention can yield considerable insight into the manner in which Adivasi communities are stripped of their identity as a formerly nomadic group and who are made utterly dependent upon the state and turned into supplicants. In my own work, I have referred to this transformation, this process of supplication, as a movement from people in place to people in networks. Microinterventions can highlight new forms of marginalization that arise from this kind of sequestering, and it sheds light upon the collapse of systems of civic governance and their replacement by a structured, often communal/religious clientelism that is responsive to privilege rather than to process. And microinterventions can also build a better and richer understanding of the structural factors at play in producing, ultimately, deliberative silence and suppression. In other words, it is only by trying to act that you realize what the barriers actually are. But that's not to say that microinterventions are all we should be doing as ethnographic researchers. They can be highly problematic. Engaging in a microintervention can play into a broader and problematic narrative of researchers as imperial saviors, ironically reinforcing the already flourishing clientelist system and a rather brutal kind of sorting order where upper caste and westernized people end up being the clients, including researchers, and Adivasis are further sequestered as supplicants. If a microintervention goes awry or has no results, it will alienate researchers from the communities that they're attempting to engage with, contributing to the already keen sense of hostility and suspicion that tribals have to outsiders. And microinterventions can contribute to the continuing marginalization of the community by not building capacity for them to effect change themselves, relying instead on the researcher or the NGO to do so. I spoke about the potentially problematic aspects of the savior complex with a colleague, Sita Venkateswaran, who, interestingly, pushed back on it quite forcefully. And she asked me to start with what I was getting out of this project. And to my surprise, I found myself talking with her about having spent formative years in the region, and that I'd not thought about that in many decades. But when I was in Lokere, I could look up at the hills above me and actually, in the distance, actually see my old boarding school. I'd not thought about that in a long, long time. And spending time there with that community was beginning to feel like a bit of a revelatory homecoming. So she said, well, there's a potentially dialogic aspect to your fieldwork. There are things that you are getting out of this that, in a sense, makes you a supplicant to the community that you are working with. And it's in that sense that framing yourself as a savior, as someone who has something to give but nothing to take, is a bit of a problem. So thinking about micro-interventions purely in terms of a savior complex is reductive. I understand and appreciate that. And what I'm coming around to is the idea that micro-interventions are important and they are a good supplement to ethnographic fieldwork, but they are not a substitute for multi-year ethnographic immersion. It is only when you've been in a field site for many years at a time that communities will trust you to actually act and speak on their behalf, if that. So I'm going to simply close with a few discussion questions in the hope that it will spark some sort of virtual conversation. And I'll lay out four for you. The first of these is what kinds of exclusionary and inclusionary dynamics can you see here? Because both of those are at work, right? And more specifically, secondly, in what ways can inclusionary dynamics that incorporate and include communities, how can inclusionary dynamics, or how might they be problematic for indigenous communities anywhere? Third, how can we both engage in and problematize microinterventions in our own writing and teaching across contexts, regardless of whether or not we're working in schools, whether or not we're working in universities, or whether or not we're working in nonprofits or NGOs or in social movements. And finally, in what ways can we think of to help students, high school students, university students, undergraduates, postgraduates? How can we help students become more attentive to the central place that Indigenous communities can occupy in conservation movements all over the world? I'll end with that. Thank you so much for your time again.